the Bitcoin Spot ETF still has not been approved in the United States. You all have the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, and I know that you've been pretty vocal about getting that converted into the Spot ETF. Talk to us just about where we stand with that situation and kind of what your thought process is in terms of when it'll get approved.
Sure. So I think we got to take a step back and really think about how the SEC's thinking has evolved around this. So if you rewind even just a couple of months, Pomp, there was literally just a blanketed no. There were no Bitcoin ETFs allowed to come into the market. And that was fine because at least the SEC was approaching this with a level mindset. No futures-based ETFs, no spot-based ETFs. And then a couple months ago, they approved the first 40 Act Bitcoin Futures ETF. And that was a big deal. It's a big deal for those of us in crypto, big deal for the investment management industry as a whole. And what we found was, wow, now the SEC is starting to really move along in their thinking. Maybe their thinking's evolved because they'd always said that they had issues with the underlying Bitcoin market. Were there going to be issues around fraud or manipulation? Was there enough surveillance of the underlying Bitcoin market? And what was interesting is that the SEC said that 40 Act registered products, right? So products that hold Bitcoin futures contracts, they had certain protections that they favored for investors that 33 Act products, which would just be spot products, products that hold Bitcoin, didn't have. And so all of a sudden the SEC kind of had this kind of unfair advantage, unfair playing field that they'd created by liking one set of regulation over the other. And then a couple weeks ago, we saw the first 33 Act Bitcoin futures product approved. So now what we said is, whoa, maybe the SEC isn't relying on these protections as much anymore. And those protections, interestingly, are not the kind of things that solve the SEC's issues with the underlying Bitcoin market. Instead, it's things like independent, boards and custody and accounting rules. So now we have this playing field where investors are forced into using Bitcoin futures products, both 40 Act and 33 Act products. And so many of us in the industry, at Grayscale included, feel that the next natural step for the SEC is to approve a spot Bitcoin ETF registered under the 33 Act, where as Grayscale is doing it with our existing fund, GBTC, working proactively with them to uplist to the New York Stock Exchange as a bona fide spot Bitcoin ETF.
So as you've gone through this, I think your logic makes a ton of sense in terms of their evolution, that they're kind of increasing acceptance that this industry is here. It's not going anywhere, and investors want exposure to it. What has been the conversations with the SEC or even other regulators, and what is their appetite currently? And do you think that we get a Bitcoin Spot ETF this year?
So it's tough to put a time frame on it, Pomp. I'd say that it continues to be a matter of when, not a matter of if, right? The full resources of our firm is behind this initiative, and we will continue to advocate on behalf of investors until that approval comes through. But I would say that in the, call it 5-6 years that we've been dealing with the SEC and regulators more generally, a lot has changed. So number one, let's remember that they have a tough job, right? Even think about how long you've been in the crypto industry and how much things have changed. It's tough as a regulator to develop really good regulations when the industry and the asset class underneath it continues to change. New attributes, new features, new use cases. So in the one hand, we certainly sympathize with the SEC and other regulators out there. On the other hand, though, as you said, this industry and this asset class isn't going away. And so by investors not proactively continuing to advocate for this and then having regulators answer that call and bring these assets closer into the regulatory perimeter, they're really not helping or really protecting anybody. And so I will say that while it's frustrating to not have achieved a spot Bitcoin ETF just yet, that the level of knowledge and the level of education that regulators are bringing to these conversations has changed dramatically. We're never doing Bitcoin 101, 201 kind of questions. We're actually really diving deeply into protocols, into the integrity of blockchains, thinking about the use cases and really helping investors and the use cases that they're excited about, having those narratives brought to regulators so that they're looking at this through a fully informed lens.
And so as we kind of continue through this, obviously there's been multiple people have put forward applications. Most of those applications for the Bitcoin Spot ETF have been people who aspirationally want to create an ETF. I think you all are probably, if not the only one, definitely the leader in terms of we already have an existing fund. It has tens of billions of dollars already in it, and we simply want to convert it. Is there any indication in terms of how the SEC thinks about the difference between creating a fund from scratch as an ETF versus the conversion process? And are there maybe historical examples of where they prefer one over the other? Or just like, how are you guys thinking about that?
This is a great question. You know, we were down at the ETF Exchange conference in Miami a couple of weeks ago, and we did our Twitter Spaces, and our friend Michael Saylor jumped on and said that because of that differentiation, exactly what you're talking about, the fact that Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, GBTC, already exists, has tens of billions of dollars, over 800,000 investor accounts that are already invested in it, that the SEC does need to look at it differently than the way that they might look at some of the other applications in front of them, which are just merely ideas on paper. And that's not for us to disparage any of the other issuers or any of the other products that are trying to come to market. We do believe in the future you will see multiple Bitcoin spot ETFs on the market. But at the moment, the SEC does have a product that is trading every single day in investor accounts, small investors, large investors, retirement accounts, really as widespread as you can imagine, with investors actually in all 50 states. So when you do think about how the SEC should approach this, they do need to understand that if they don't bring this under their purview and allow this to become an ETF, have investors have that familiarity, have that protection that the ETF wrapper provides, they're really not fulfilling their mandate in protecting investors.
So when you start to think about this, the SEC at some point has to make decisions. They can continue to kind of kick the can down the road on these applications, but at some point they do rubber meets the road and they got to say, hey, approve or not approved. I believe that your latest application or kind of the current one, they have to make that decision over the summer. One, is that true? And then two, if they don't approve it, what are the options that you all have? Do you just have to reapply, or are there other avenues that you could pursue that maybe could help accelerate this?
So because this type of product is entirely new and would be entirely new to the US market, it actually requires a rule change. And anytime there's a rule change, there's a standard 240-day period during which the SEC is evaluating the application, and importantly, during which investors can actually write in about the application in favor of it or not in favor of it. So that 240-day clock, to answer your question, expires on July the 6th. So we have a couple weeks left before the SEC's decision to approve or deny GBTC is ultimately reached. Once we get to that deadline, and of course, we and many, many investors are, of course, hopeful for a positive outcome, there are all kinds of options on the table, one of which we've talked about before publicly is the idea of a lawsuit. And the grounds of a lawsuit here would really be a violation of something called the Administrative Procedures Act. The APA, or the Administrative Procedures Act, really governs the way that regulators regulate. And so when they're looking at two issues that are alike, they have to look at them through a like lens. And in the case of what we have here, they're looking favorably and allowing Bitcoin futures products into the market, but perhaps not allowing Bitcoin spot products into the market. And the issue with that disparity is that both of those products, if they're really thinking about what their hesitations are, it has to do with pricing. And the Bitcoin futures contract gets its pricing from the spot Bitcoin exchanges. And of course, a Bitcoin spot product gets its pricing from the spot Bitcoin exchanges. So what we have here are two like issues that aren't being treated alike. And that in fact could be grounds for a lawsuit to the SEC.